Welcome to Startup Dads, a podcast about the highs and lows of building a business and raising a family at the same time. For more information about the topics we cover on the podcast and other Startup Dads related content, you can follow us on Twitter at StartupDadsPod. I'm Amrit, co-founder of Hyperexponential, a tech startup that I co-founded in 2017. It's grown from a two-person team working out of my kitchen to a profitable business with several large clients and more than 20 team members across London and Europe. I'm also dad to Evie, my first child, who was born last December. So welcome to another episode of Startup Dads, or should I say Startup Mums, because I'm delighted to say we've got our very first startup mum on the podcast today. I've got Rachel Carrell. Rachel, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what makes you a startup mum?
Sure. So I'm Rachel. I'm the CEO and founder of Koru Kids, and we're a childcare tech startup based in London. We recruit and train and match and manage nannies, specialising in after-school care for that tricky after-school period. But we're actually growing a lot beyond that now, and we're about to launch some extremely exciting new services this year, which I may or may not tell you more about as we go. I have got two kids. One of them is 3 years old and the other one's 6 years old. And the 6-year-old was the inspiration for me to do my startup in the first place when I was actually the CEO of a healthcare company. And I had my first baby and I experienced childcare and realized how incredibly difficult it was. And it kind of took me by surprise because I assumed there would be a system and there wasn't a system. And so I founded Koru Kids to solve not just the problem that I faced, but all the many variations of it that I saw my friends facing as well. And then I had my second child right in the midst of doing this startup thing. So that makes me a startup mom.
Amazing. You are incredibly well qualified to talk about all of the trials and tribulations, highs and lows of both parenthood and foundership. So brilliant stuff. So Rachel, let's jump in. So Koru Kids, starting a nanny business, it's amazing to see how Koru Kids has been one of the successful pandemic pivots. Can you tell me a little bit about how you adapted your business in response to what must have been a completely unprecedented set of events for your clients and for you?
It was. So we had a huge amount of churn in March when a lot of parents didn't want their nanny in their home with them anymore. So we had to very suddenly start looking at other things that we could be supporting parents with. And one of the things that was really weird and interesting about last year was parents were under so much pressure and, trying to homeschool and work at the same time. It was just impossible. At the same time, a lot of parents didn't want to use the childcare services that were out there. So we did quite a lot of experimenting with different kinds of alternatives. So, for example, virtual nannying, that kind of thing. We experimented for about a month or so. And what we decided to do in about April was actually just hunker down and focus on our product. And it was obvious that this pandemic was going to end at some point. And luckily, we had raised a good round, 6 months previously. So what we decided to do was just stay lean, focus on our core business, and not create what I call pandemic product, like product just for the pandemic, but instead focus on creating the stuff that we know post-pandemic is going to be the stuff that parents want. And that's how we've navigated through.
I think that can be one of the hardest things to do, is to stay focused at times like that where there is so much uncertainty. So what motivates your focus on product and how you manage to develop a product that's really impactful to your clients in the long term in the face of the kind of challenges you were facing?
My motivation comes from a few different places. Mostly I get really annoyed. My motivation is based on annoyance. I get annoyed at how dismissed childcare is. And I think we've really seen this in the pandemic, actually. Parents were under so much pressure and there was hardly any government support in terms of funding, anything like that. I get annoyed that this infrastructure doesn't exist already. I really think we should be thinking about childcare as infrastructure. I think we should be thinking about it in the same way that we think about roads or water pipes or bridges. It is fundamental basic infrastructure, and I don't think we think about it like that, and I don't think it gets respected like that or funded like that. And then I look at the impact that the lack of childcare, of good quality childcare infrastructure has on my friends' lives, and I have so many so many friends who either had to cut back their hours when they didn't want to, leave the job that they'd worked so hard to get when they didn't want to, move out of London for childcare reasons, even not have another child because they couldn't afford some of the costs and things. It's really profound, the impact that these inadequacies have. And Britain is one of the worst countries in the world for it, In other countries and most of Europe, it's funded really, really well. There's lots of great high quality provision. In much of the world, the extended family steps in, and the saying it takes a village to raise a child, you have that because you have extended family. Unfortunately, in the UK, we don't have any of those things, Often, obviously there's exceptions, but often extended family isn't around and we don't have the government support. And so parents are just left to do it all themselves. And it's impossible, we weren't built to do that. So my motivation comes from just getting really passionate about these problems. And then I think of the next order effects, which is a lack of women in leadership, because of course this mostly impacts on women. And, you see the horrendous way that the government has managed through the pandemic. And, I just think we need more women in leadership. We've got lots of examples of where having women in leadership through the pandemic in other countries led to a lot of very empathetic communication, compassionate policies, very decisive action, different forms of risk management. I think there's a lot that women bring to leadership. So all of these reasons, I could go on, but that's enough motivation probably.
That's fantastic. And, I think one of the things I realized, I had my first child after setting up HX, and you realize how much support you do need, whatever you're doing. If you're working, you need huge amounts of support. And you're absolutely right. I think when you think about, we have and did get a lot of support from my family when Evie was first born. And what this pandemic did is it made me realize it, because obviously it was just much more difficult or impossible, depending on bubble restrictions, to get any support at all. It made us realize how many people don't have any support. Right. And actually, the mechanisms don't exist. Quite frankly, it's difficult enough as it is with support. And without the support, I've got huge amounts of respect for people who try and get anything at all done with a small child. So I suppose taking that a little bit further, so, particularly a business like yours, so how did you kind of thread the product strategy through the pandemic? And how did you pull that through into your sense of mission?
For us, it was really about sticking to our core mission, and that is about helping families flourish. And luckily, we were able to think more long term. I was always inspired by that very famous Simon Sinek video, one of the most viewed business videos of all time, the people don't buy what, they buy why. And we have spent quite a lot of time working on our why. I think that helped the team, and it also, helped our users, I think, trust that we were trying to make families flourish. That's our why. And whatever we did or attempted to do, that was the detail. But we never deviated from that central purpose.
Getting your why right is such an incredibly valuable foundation as your business scales. Focusing the mind on the why early is extremely valuable. So I suppose the other side of the coin then, thinking away from the product, is your team. So how did you lead your team through these challenges?
Yeah, I think once you've got that mission alignment, that is a large part of it. And I remember something that I read years ago saying that what people really need from their job is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And in order to be happy in your role, those are the three things that you need. And purpose is kind of the one that we've just been talking about. Autonomy, meaning freedom. You get to decide maybe not exactly what you're working on, but, how you're doing it and when you're doing it and where you're doing it. And mastery, meaning you need to have the feeling that you're good at what you're doing. You're actually achieving stuff. So I think about those three things quite a lot when I'm trying to think about what the individuals in my team need. And purpose kind of comes naturally. Mastery sometimes needs to be balanced with development, but everyone should be working on, something that they're mostly really good at, but also has a learning element to it. And then autonomy, well, that's been a really interesting one to think about when we're in a remote work situation, because in a sense, everyone has lots of autonomy. They can work whenever they want. They can theoretically work wherever they want, but they can't actually, because it has to be always in the same room, right? So we've been trying to increase the flexibility that we give people. We were always pretty flexible, to be honest. I think we were, a typical startup in that way, but trying to increase autonomy. And I think to the extent that people are hemmed in now, they can't just go to a cafe and work from there. That has definitely taken a toll on people's mental health. But, by and large, the culture that we created pre-pandemic, I think has put enough in our bank account, so to speak, the theoretical bank account of culture, that we've been able to make withdrawals on it for the last year and still be in a pretty good place. But definitely cannot wait to get back together physically and start to make some deposits in our trust account rather than just always withdrawals.
I absolutely agree with that. HX, our business, we have a mental health coach that we've just started investing in that. And I think it's been something incredibly valuable. And we're very similar to you. Can't wait now to go and recharge that battery. Do you think about this? I mean, I don't know. This is one of the things I love to ask founders with kids. Do you think about that with your children? I mean, I know, we've both got very young children, but do you think about that in terms of, helping them and their development?
I absolutely do. So I am obsessed with child development. It's one of the reasons that I founded Koru Kids, and I love working in the job that I do. So one of the books, I've actually got it right in front of me right now, is a book called The Self-Driven Child, and it's all about how we control our children to a way greater extent than previous generations. So, the stereotype is kind of in previous generations, like in the 70s or early 80s, whatever, children would open the front door at the start of the day, let's say it's a holiday, and go out into the street and sort of roam around with their friends and like maybe come home for lunch and definitely come home for dinner. And that was just their day. And if you did that today, depending on the age of the child, you might find a knock on your door and social services has arrived, right? Like that, it is fundamentally different now. And schools don't even let children walk home by themselves until they're year 6. In other words, the kid is about 10 years old. That is so different to when I was growing up. And I'm from New Zealand, so I also, I grew up in a different country, a different culture. And in New Zealand, still now today, gives children a hell of a lot more autonomy and freedom than the UK does. So I personally, because of my cultural background, I find the UK approach very, very restrictive. Anyway, this book is basically all about how we control our children, not just in terms of, not letting them roam free, but when they are in the house, we schedule them, we give them tons of homework. A lot of middle-class children will be learning 2 instruments and have like debate club and, whatever else. They're under so much pressure and control. And this book kind of goes into all the connections, lays the foundations for anxiety and depression and a lot of mental challenges that a lot of teenagers are having right now. And so it's something that I think about a lot. And even though my kids are only 3 and 6, I think there's a lot of ways that I give them as much autonomy as possible. And one thing that I started doing with my daughter when she was 4, which has been brilliant, is giving her pocket money and giving her complete control over what she spends her pocket money on. And I have to work very hard to, like my own self-discipline, to not express any opinions about, like, I try to not even show in my face when I think she's making a terrible decision. I remember one time she wanted to spend all her money, and she'd saved up 6 weeks worth of pocket money or something on like a nail kit that looked like it was made for a granny. And I was kind of like, no, this is the worst purchase ever. This is a terrible idea. And I was like, oh God, but I wanted to give her total control. So it was like, okay, that's your decision. And she freaking loved this nail kit. Like, she loved it. She got so much value out of this granny nail kit. I learned from that, it wasn't about the nail kit. It was about the decision. It was about that it was her choice. And, our children are so starved of opportunities to make genuine decisions and like take control that when you give them a tiny bit of control, they just soak it up. They like lap it up. So yes, that is something I think about a lot.
That's amazing. And it's such a great story. And it's the parallels are so resonant between, your team members and children in that way. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way for team, but, it applies to all of us, myself included, is that often when you let people, you give them some freedom and flexibility to follow the things that they see as important at work, they surprise you in a really great way, in a way you didn't expect. The former CEO of Evernote talks about the most points you can get with him are by doing something that he didn't expect and bringing something incredibly valuable to him. But, it just goes to show you may have not thought it was a good idea, but it was, in a really great way, and letting your kids surprise you.
Yeah, it is amazing. The more I learn about child development, I think the better manager I am. And the more I learn about good management, the better mum I am, And it's because, there's some differences in the way that children think, and there are parts of their brains that are not developed yet. They don't have the what's called the executive function part, so the kind of frontal lobe, like planning part of their brain that develops last, actually isn't fully developed until your mid-20s, by the way. So it really takes a while. There are some fundamental differences, but I think the similarities are more than the differences, Children are complex emotional beings with complex emotional lives, and so is everyone. So are all humans. And the more we learn about it, I think the better managers and the better parents we are.
It's been a beautiful, wonderful realization for me. Evie's 15 months old, how remarkably complex she is already. And quite frankly, how much she's got me down, and her schemes and plans are already working. And that I need to give her much more credit. I was just telling our producer before the show that I came over earlier and found her undoing the microphone that I'm talking to right now. Thought she's definitely got plans to play some tricks on me. So at a very early age, I think it's amazing. And that's a wonderful thing. As you said, we're all just people. So lastly, Rachel, before we get onto the kind of wrap-up questions and start-up shout-outs, what about you? You're the leader of a business. You've had to pivot. You've had to reframe, refocus. It must have been a roller coaster of a year. Steering the ship must be amazing, right? Must have been amazing, but also brutal. So what are the big lessons you've learned through the pandemic?
It has been brutal. And there definitely have been times of high adrenaline. That first month when we were just adapting so quickly, one of the things I'm really proud of is before furlough got announced, we actually invented our own scheme we didn't call it furlough, obviously, because we know that was going to come, but the team reacted so quickly. It was incredible. From night till day, there would be government announcements, and then the team would immediately have help center articles written, emails out, brief the customer service team. It was brilliant. And we were just operating on such high adrenaline. And then I think a lot of us just had a crash. And I went through the same thing a lot of people did with, just feeling exhausted. I think, for the first time ever in my life, I was wondering whether I was experiencing burnout. I took some tests and worried about my cortisol and, all this stuff. And I've always operated at a fairly intense level. I've always worked very hard, whether it's uni or professional life. And this was the first time in my life that I'd ever really thought about that. So I think it's the big thing for me has just been the importance of rest. And as a startup founder, you have to be relentless in your pursuit and you have to be persistent. But this period has been relentless. And it used to be that we would have our commute, and I always thought that was kind of annoying. I didn't realize how much I needed it. I didn't realize that my brain needed that. I've become much more purposeful about rest, and especially brain rest. I did a transcendental meditation course about 6 months ago. I'd tried meditation many times and I'd never really liked it. And then I did this course, and for some reason, I just liked this version of it, basically. It was like a different kind of meditation, and I just liked it. So I started doing that and just trying to be very purposeful about the rest that I'm having, because otherwise you just never stop.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think as a founder, particularly a founder with kids, your time is something that it always feels, I think this is not even a founder with kids, for all founders, your time feels just scarce, right? And the things that were an irritation before, you didn't realize what they were doing for you, right? Things like, I've got to sit on the bus, or I'm waiting in between meetings in the city, or whatever it is. You're absolutely right. We take those things for granted. And now that, you can literally be bouncing out of one meeting into another, I think it's amazing how we forgot you didn't do that for a lot of meetings because you had to speak to someone different in a different location. And it wasn't a matter of closing a window and opening up another one.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I used to spend a lot of my day getting on the tube, getting off, walking for 10 minutes, and all of these mental resets that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, it's exactly true. Rachel, on to the final question that I like to ask every guest. What's the biggest lesson you've learned from your journey in entrepreneurship that you want to pass on to your children?
I think for me, it's persistence to really try and break through barriers. And we do have a saying in our family, which is you have to try 10 times. So the kids ask me if I can do something like, Mummy, can you do this for me? And I will say to them, have you tried 10 times? And the reason that 10 is important is because it's a lot of times. And often I find with my kids, they'll do the same thing again and again. They'll kind of do it 3 times and then they'll give up and say, Mummy. And I'll say, have you done it 10 times? And they'll go, oh, no, I've only done it 3 times. Oh, okay, try it 10 times. You feel quite stupid doing exactly the same thing 10 times. So the reason 10 is important is because you tend to do the same thing like 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And then you think, oh, I'm not going to do this. And then you try something else, right? And you kind of try a slightly different way. And then maybe that doesn't work a couple of times. And then you're like, oh, I've got to do 3 more. Okay, fine, I'll try this. And it's amazing how many times like try number 8 or try number 9 is actually the one that works. And it's because you've changed what you've done slightly and you've basically iterated. And that's a skill that I think I would love my kids to have. And it's such an entrepreneur founder skill. So that's why we always say that.
That's brilliant. Absolutely stealing that from you. I'm not quite sure I can use it on Evie just yet, but I definitely am going to use that. I read something on Twitter recently that talks about rate of iteration and persistence trumps brilliance every time. And I think it's something that really resonates with me too. So, well, Rachel, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. Absolutely honoured to have you as our first startup mum. Before we wrap up, I'd like to close with our regular feature, Startup Shoutouts, where we shine a light on some of the organisations we admire in the startup or kind of entrepreneurial space.
Startup Shoutouts.
So I'd love to give you a chance to do that. Pick an organisation and tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, I've got one that I absolutely love, which is called Little Village. And they are a small charity based in London. And it's kind of like a food bank, but it's for clothes and toys and equipment for babies and children up to the age of 5. And I think it's been pretty tough for them during the pandemic because it's been harder to deal with donated items. But as things open up, hopefully they're going to get a lot of stuff. And I love this because we accumulate so many things, don't we, for kids? I'm sure you're experiencing this right now. And, a lot of things your baby probably barely plays with, a lot of clothes that you get given when they're born. This is one really wonderful way of disposing of your really high quality things that another family could really, really love.
That's fantastic. We'll be sure to link to them in the show notes and make sure that people can find out about them. Brilliant. Well, Rachel, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can we find you, find Koru Kids? Is there anything you'd like to give a little bit of a shout out on behalf of Koru Kids for before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, if anyone needs in-home childcare, they should Google Koru Kids, Koru Kids. And also we're hiring. So if you'd like to check out our team, if you Google Koru Kids careers, you'll find all our roles. We're hiring a lot at the moment, actually, across engineering, product designers, marketers, operations, customer service, all sorts of things.
Well, you should definitely go and check out Koru Kids. I absolutely am going to do for myself. Again, thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks for coming on the show.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Many thanks to today's guest. You'll find links to them and their work in the show notes. To join our community of parent founders, head over to the Startup Dads Facebook group.